Welcome everyone to Bloody Elbow Cinema Classics with me, Zane Simon, and my co-host John Nash. We are here to talk about classic combat sports movies throughout history, the best, hopefully, combat sports movies throughout history. And on a semi-regular basis, hopefully once a month, new show, new idea. We'll see how it shakes out. We'll see how long before I want to kill John or John wants to kill me. So, what are we talking about first on this show?
The first movie we're going to do is the 1949 classic, The Setup, starring Robert Ryan, directed by Robert Weiss. Robert Weiss was the editor to Orson Welles and Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons. Went on to be one of the great all-time directors, especially of genre movies. Did The Haunting. Most people probably recognize him from his West Side Story, Sound of Music, or Star Trek. But 1949, he turned out a film noir masterpiece. We're going to talk about that. Of course, it's a boxing picture because God knows boxing pictures have all the great masterpieces and MMA have none. So a quick summary of today's film. It came out in 1949 and stars Robert Ryan as Stoker Thompson, an aging boxer who's hoping to get back on track with his career, and Audrey Totter as his wife Julie, who doesn't know if she can bear to witness him take any more beatings.
I understand that he's 23 and you're 35, Bill.
Little does Stoker know that for his next match against a young up-and-comer, his manager and trainer were paid a measly $50 for him to take the fall.
30? I thought you said 50.
You know, Danny.
Only a fin.
Confident that he can't win and unwilling to split the payoff with him, they decide not to inform him. The whole 72-minute movie takes place over one evening, with the majority of it in the locker room, as Stoker waits for his match and interacts with a diverse group of boxers. That's the general premise. I'm not going to give away what happens, but that's the setup for the movie. And if that sounds interesting, and it should because it's a goddamn good movie, you should watch it. So what I want to talk to with Zane here is how much I think this movie still relates to modern combat sports. And I think you agree with that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. It's one of the few combat sports movies that I've seen. And, you know, we've both seen a lot of movies. You maybe a few more than me, maybe, but it's one of the few I've seen about combat sports that literally only focuses on one fight, on one night in a fighter's life and one fight in their life. And because of that, the narrative around the movie is the actual narrative of a fight, rather than trying to build this like, oh, and this is the narrative of like, you know, his rise and fall from stardom or his whole career as a boxer or whatever. And a lot of, you know, it covers Robert Ryan's career, it encapsulates it in that one night of a fight. But because of that, it makes it a much more easy movie to transport as relevant across time, because it's really just, it's the narrative of a night in a fighter's life.
Yeah, actually, it was really clever too. Is that that device they use that it's real time, which they actually did 3 years before High Noon famously did it. So they beat High Noon to the idea the whole movie takes place basically in real time.
Yeah,
they have a clock that ticks, and so the movie's only 72 minutes long. In 72 minutes, they cram a lot. And I think what's genius is he goes into the locker room, and there's a bunch of boxers in there with them in the locker room getting ready for the matches. They all serve as archetypes of boxers, but they also kind of represent him in various phases of his career.
Yep.
And they have the young guy that's really scared, nervous about his first fight. They have the up-and-coming boxer. He's the future star, and he's an African-American boxer, which is interesting, too, because at the time, it's one of the first post-World War II movies where they started offering black actors better roles, and it also is a throwback to the original poem that the movie's based on. If anybody's read the original poem, the poem was actually about a black boxer, and they had to change it. It's a Joseph Von Kerr March poem, I think, and they had to change it because, technically, you know, America was still kind of racist, and also at the time, there was no black stars. The guy that plays the black boxer, James Edwards, if this movie had been made a few years later, he might have been the star of the movie. But anyways, he plays a guy who's looking, if he wins, he's into a big main event boxing match. He's on up and going career. They have a character named Gunboat, played by the character actor David Clark, who's who's basically a punch drunk older boxer who's taking too much damage. So they do this great thing with all the other boxers in the locker room with them, each one telling a little tale as they wait for their fight, and basically showing almost the career steps of a boxer.
Yeah, it's a career, and I liked it because it's, like I say too, it is for something that happens in a night. You really get a sense of who, like, what Robert Ryan's career is and what a fighter's career is, because you see all of these moments of success and failure that Robert Ryan gets to experience before he ever walks in the ring. You get to see all these other fighters who come out and they, they're in the back and they're like, oh, I'm going to win. I can feel it. And I know I'm going to win. And, you see one guy who's saying that and just gets shit kicked. And then you see another guy who's saying that and he comes back and he won. And Robert Ryan's seeing all this, and you can tell that he knows that this is all his thought process and this is all what's happening to him, and that he's been in these situations and he is going to be in these situations, and that it still doesn't. It's like watching a fighter where they get to see all of the cues of all of the good and bad things about their career, and they still say, but that's not what's going to happen to me. Like, I'm not going to see, the bad isn't going to happen to me, or the success that this kid's talking about. Like, oh yeah, maybe he's a little starry-eyed. Maybe that's not, that's still, like, that's not who I am either. But I will only, like, no matter what, I get to push forward through this because I can tell that my vision is the right one.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell that. I think that's partly a demonstration how good Robert Ryan is with his reactions, and also how good Robert Weiss is, and the cinematographer Milton Krasner, who's a brilliant film noir cinematographer, black and white, Double Life, No Way Out. You ever see those? Amazing cinematography. But this, the way they tell a story, you can see what he's thinking almost all the time without ever saying a word.
Yeah,
he looks across out the window to see if his wife's going to show up for the match, and he keeps seeing the light at the hotel, meaning she's not coming. And his reactions as he looks on these other boxers telling their confessing to their fears or their hopes. And I think the saddest, even though I don't think he does a good job, David Clark's generally a pretty good character actor, but as Gunboat, he's not that particularly convincing. But the character itself's pretty damn depressing.
Yeah.
An old boxer that's obviously taking way too many blows, still fighting, used up, and you could just see that Robert Ryan looking at him thinking, is that my future if I keep doing this? What's also great, I think, is the way people treat the boxers. You can just really see how boxers are used as they're disposable cannon fodder. The gangsters don't care about it. The manager and trainer that sold them out, they don't really care about his future. There's a great opening shot, revealing shot outside the arena where they introduced a lot of the players without even introducing Robert Ryan's Stoker Thompson. They haven't introduced him yet, but they introduced his name on the poster. And his manager, lights a match by crossing it over his name. Like, that's how little he cares about his own fighter. And I think that's, and today I think that holds up. You see managers and trainers who, they seem to be there just to basically feed off the fighters.
The fascinating thing for me with the crossover today, especially with something like MMA, is that I think MMA is really trying to fight hard against that. Despite the fact that that's still the inevitable result, because MMA doesn't really, they don't have career. There aren't a lot of professional opponents in MMA. It's especially when you get up to something like the UFC or Bellator, less so. Bellator is a little bit more of the, like, we're booking you with the idea that you are going to help prop up this guy that we have already decided is our star. But we don't have that culture of the career of the professional opponent, of the guy who just goes in and says, well, I didn't really train that hard. I'm not really here to win, but I know I'm going to make money doing this, so I'm going out to make money. And because of that, I think that culture is a little less enmeshed in MMA, but we're also, I think, starting to maybe turn a corner where it's going to become more of a reality as we've become more and more of a star-driven sport where certain people need propping.
Yeah, it's different in the sense that we also, at the high ends, we don't have like the corruption that boxing had, at least on the organized crime. So we don't have an Oni Madden. We don't have a Frankie Garbeau, running the boxing world, demanding that you take a fall to get a title shot. But I do think in MMA, we do see fighters in the sense that they have very little influence over their careers.
Yeah.
I mean, we could say she might not be a professional fighter, but the Yana over the weekend against Valentina, that was pretty much a sacrificial lamb, if there ever was one.
Yeah, that's very much clearly. But I think the difference there would be that probably, not only did Cachoeira passionately believe she was going to win that fight, which makes sense. She's a fighter and all that, but her manager and her coaches probably thought going in that they had that delusion was shared. I think it's much more of a shared delusion in MMA.
I think sometimes, but I also think there's managers and gyms and stuff that are willing to give up, sacrifice their fighters to keep a promotion happy so they can get other fighters in that promotion.
True.
Because in a weird way, in MMA, a lot of managers and gyms, they don't make money off one star. They make it almost by bulk, selling masses of fighters to promotions and getting a percentage. What I think works best, though, tying it today, is the Spectators. They have a great thing where they keep showing these characters, these spectators show up, and it's basically they're the Romans at the gladiator arena watching the Christians getting fed to the lions. They are there just to see blood. They have no interest in what happens to the fighters. And I think that part almost is the most modern part, because you can see people acting exactly the same today.
Yeah, especially the scene that really sticks with me on that is when his wife is walking around town trying to avoid going to the fight and just do anything other than think about what her husband is going through. And she walks by the newsstand where they're listening to the fights on the radio. And she just, I can't remember if she tells him to turn it off or she just sort of like turns away, and the guy at the newsstand's like, "Oh, what? Too violent for you, and is it too gruesome for you to hear like about this blood sport?" And just is like totally uncaring of like the idea that anybody might actually be personally invested, and just assumes that like, oh, it's just bloody, and so you don't like it, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, Audrey Tata, she did. I thought it was kind of it would be normally a thankless supporting role, the wife, But this, I thought they did a good job of showing just her dilemma of, does she want to stick with her husband or not? And she's trying to do everything to distract herself, walk around the city, and she keeps running into stuff reminding her about the boxing match. But the other spectators too, that there's the lady that says she hates blood, and then at the end she's yelling, "Let him fight!" Or the blind man that has his friend telling him to fight, and he's telling him, sadistically telling him, "Work the eye, work the eye." Yeah. Which is, it seems absurd, but I could imagine, you've ever been on Twitter, you could tell, he should be working that eye.
It's true. No, I mean, you read all the fan stuff you read and all the fan stuff we see day in and day out. People are not really less bloodthirsty than they ever used to be.
Yeah, it hasn't changed. Another thing I really liked about the movie, I thought this nailed it, is that its presentation of boxing compared to most other movies was pretty damn realistic.
Yeah.
It nailed almost everything. There's the opening shots of the movie, which is, I guess, can give it away because it's the opening of the movie, is probably the only part that's not real time, or it might be what's going on at that time in the ring. But all it is a shot of basically the waist down of two boxers in the ring. And that alone tells a story. One is old and slow and sluggish, like he's been taking a beating. And the other one you can see moving around nimbly on his feet. And you're like, this guy, and you can just see that the younger guy that's healthy is winning the fight just based on his footwork.
Yeah.
And I thought that little touch right there, right then sets you up. These guys kind of know boxing. And it makes sense. Robert Ryan, the star, if anybody doesn't know, he actually boxed in college.
And he was in the military too. He boxed in the military.
He was a drill sergeant during World War II. And in college, he was the 4-year heavyweight champion of Dartmouth, which is in college back then they took boxing more serious. That's not like a light title to be a 4-year champion in boxing. And he also actually, I guess in his early days, he worked as a stoker, which is why they changed the character's name from the poem Pansy Jones to Stoker Thompson in honor of him, Stoker. So that's a little trivia. But
it's also it's good in that regard too, that not only does Robert Ryan know what he's doing a bit, but that it's also like it's supposed to be a low-level boxing card, like this small town, small event, packed house, but local stars and like up and coming, no big name fights on the card, really.
Like it says on the marquee, boxing on Wednesday, wrestling on Fridays.
Exactly. And so the fact that the boxing, it's like pretty rudimentary and a little like clunky, because almost any movie boxing is going to be rudimentary and clunky, you know, from something like an Ali biopic down to, or Raging Bull, down to this, or like Hard Times, it's always going to look about the same. And so actually shooting boxing, what's not supposed to be like the elite top boxers in the world, you get like, it feels much more of a natural use of acting talent than trying to get people to parody like elite pro boxing.
Yeah, if this was elite, you'd be laughing because but it's supposed to be an ugly match. He's made it ugly to win, and there's little touches too that you like. His opponent Tiger Nelson, like it punches at him, and like you're like, well, for a regular match, he'd be, it's almost like a Rocky thing. He keeps hitting it, but if you're paying attention, it's Robert Ryan's catching him with the gloves. Mm-hmm. He's actually blocking him. It's not Rocky where he's eating it in the face 40 times. There's little touches like that. So, and they're pulling punches. Obviously, they're not throwing super hard because they're not actually murdering each other. They're actors, but there is aesthetically it looks somewhat real that they're beaten down. There's low blows, and there's little touches outside of that were great. Like you could tell a person's position in their career based on the robes they're wearing. And Hawkins, I guess James Edwards' character, that's a rising star. He has nice robes. Tiger Nelson, the champ, the guy he's fighting, that they're trying to move up to a better event, has nice robes. Stoker Thompson, Robert Ryan's character, the main character, he has kind of frayed robes. Then you get to like Gunboat, and his robes are like a bathrobe,
Yeah.
You can read right away where their career is based on how crappy their robes are, good or crappy.
One of the other things this movie kind of cued me into, and maybe you can tell me a little bit more about this assumption, because it's something I've read it in other places too, so I'm not just making the leap, but this movie was the first thing that kind of cued me into the idea that when you fix a fight, you don't actually fix it with the fighter as often as not. Like there are times, obviously, where fighters get paid to take a dive specifically, but even I've read other narratives of like fight fixing and boxing, and a lot of it's like, no, you fix it with the manager or with the coach, and at the right time they step up on the ring. Oh, he got hurt a little in this round, we're going to step up and throw in the towel, or get him disqualified or something like that. You don't necessarily you don't make the manager, you don't make the fighter the guy who has to act the part.
Yeah, I think because sometimes the pride the boxer won't. But there's also something like Raging Bull. I remember the Jake LaMotta. They went to his brother, his manager, and said, "You want a title shot? You've got to take this fall. Otherwise, you don't get it." And then he had to present it to him and convince him to do it. So I think that's part of it. Yeah, but it's you go to the ref and do it. There's famous cases going to the ref.
Because that's one of the things that you see. I mean, I hate this. It's one of the major MMA narratives that really pisses me off. Is that you see somebody like get hit with a weird punch and fall down, and then everybody's like, "Oh, that looked fixed." It's like, who the fuck fixes a fight that way? Yeah. Like you see how people actually fix fights, and it's usually like, you don't put it on a fighter to try and be an actor and say like, no, actor, or when you do, and we've seen that happen, it's like the most obvious weird thing, like stupid, ugly thing in the world. What's his name? The famous actor from, I'm going to say from Barfly, but that's not his most notable movie.
Oh, Mickey Rourke?
Mickey Rourke in his boxing movie, or boxing event he had in Russia recently.
Yeah. When he came back, not the ones in the 90s when he was actually boxing. When he came back,
he came back a couple years ago and he fought that dude in Russia. And you watch that fight. That is what a fixed fight where you pay a fighter to take a dive looks like. And it looks like the fakest thing you've ever seen in your life. You can spot it.
This is just my personal opinion, and I have no evidence of this, because I do think there's fixed fights going on in MMA. Just there's no way around it. There's just and weird way UFC kind of makes it harder and easier. Harder because they're obviously policing it. They do not want that to happen because it would taint their product. Easier because now fights that wouldn't get much attention are getting a lot more action bet on them than ever would have happened before. Like there's lower prelim cards are getting a lot more action bet on them than a lot of boxing matches would. So you put up a situation where someone could go to a fighter, even fighter could present himself. I'm ending my career. I'm not making much. What can we do to make a lot of money on this fight? And they set it up that way.
And MMA, like that's the other thing with MMA is that, when people talk about, oh, I saw a weird punch and I think the fight's fixed. And it's like, of all the ways you would fix a fight in MMA, that would be the dumbest way to fix a fight, is to try to pretend that you got hit really hard when all you have to do is not give up takedowns. I'm not going to go out and just let the guy punch me really hard when all I have to do is shoot in on him, fail on the shot, get sprawled out, and like fall into a sub.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I mean, I really like about this movie the idea and the target of this specific idea that you don't fix a fight by going through the fighter. Like that's that's not the first avenue that you go through to fix a fight.
It also sets up a really interesting story plot device to build suspense. Is that as a fan, you really sympathize with Stoker Thompson, his idea that he wants to go out and get one more win. He has a dream. If he gets one win, oh my God, he might be on a main card and get a $500 fight. 500, which is $5,000 a day. But that's how modest their dreams are. That's how down at the bottom they are. But you really sympathize with him. At the same time, you're aware that the gangsters expect him to lose, and that if he wins, he's in even more trouble. So it's a great device for suspense, because you're cheering for him to win because it feels great to see him win. At the same time, like, don't win, because you're going to get really screwed. Something really bad going to happen if you win.
Yeah, no kidding. One of the things interesting too about that in general, of like the sympathy you get for the characters and the way that they're presented, and this is something I just found kind of a fascinating thing rewatching it, realizing it's really interesting to see Robert Ryan and Audrey Totter in these very like straight sort of virtuous roles. Like,
oh yeah, if no one's in a film with Robert Ryan, he's one of the great all-time assholes as characters. Yeah, jerks. Bad Day at Black Rock, he was made. Act of Violence is actually sympathetic in a way, but he comes across as a villain most of it. Odds Against Tomorrow.
Yeah.
He was the jerk.
He's a great film heavy, and Audrey Totter was, this great sort of noir vixen.
Yep.
And you put them like in this very like straight, earnest, salt of the earth kind of roles, and it presents I think it does a really good job presenting this idea of two of these sort of complicated characters of like, you want to root for Robert Ryan, but he looks like this dumb heavy who's going in to like who's in over his head and doesn't understand, because he is the guy who looks like he's going to be a villain.
I think it adds to his look, though. He looks like a tough guy. He looks like a weathered, he's older than 35 at the time the movie was made, but you're like, well, I can see he's a 35. He really beat up old boxer. That's 20 years of like you say, he started when he was 14 or 15, got beat up. It's a long, but Audrey Totter, yeah, she's great. One thing I like too, she's not stereotypically beautiful back then. She was an attractive lady, but she has a little bit, she's a little older than most of the actresses, and I guess she can play a little bit more modest background than some of the other actresses. So I guess she can play both. The High Wall, she was, High Wall, she played some upper class, but she's in some great. She's a film noir icon. If you've seen Tension or Postman Always Rings Twice, that's she's done it all. But Robert Ryan's one of my all-time favorites. So
no, me too. I mean, the two of them together really, I think they carry the movie in a way that it would be an interesting movie without them, but it is a much it's a classic movie for them.
They also do a really good job, I thought, of casting some of the supporting roles, because like Percy Shelton is Red, who is in, people might remember. Who am I kidding? No one saw Kiss Me Deadly but us two. But if you saw Kiss Me Deadly, you'd recognize him. And they had Wallace Ford is the old trainer Gus in the locker room. They had George Tobias is Tiny, which is the manager. I should say Percy Shelton was the trainer. And he's just a Weasley little trainer, always wondering. He's always terrified that they're going to get found out for fixing the fight. But it's again, it's a really good, it's an excellent movie. It makes you depressed that you look at that and go, this should be the template if anybody's going to make an MMA movie. Like, why are we making MMA movies about these ridiculous blood sport type tournaments and these ridiculous over the top, they're UFC level. This is the template for an MMA movie. Down and dirty.
No kidding. Especially, get into some of the regional stuff or maybe some of the international shows out there that have been like, you know, people getting flown out on a few days' notice to fight in some tournament that's supposed to be an amateur tournament, and they show up and they find out that everybody else in it's a pro, and then they got paid. You know, nobody ever sees a dime of the money that they were supposed to get out of it. And
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's a good place for us to start because, especially like I say, the narrative of just being a fight and a night is such a great, easy way to parallel where you're not trying to look at. I mean, and that's not to say that fighters' lives don't still end up being paralleled to the way they were 100 years ago or 50 years ago or, you know, 40 years ago, whatever. But you're not looking at something like The Harder They Fall and trying to say, which we will, I'm sure, at some point, and trying to say like, oh, this is still exactly how, you know, this is exactly how it still is for fighters in MMA. Like, it's a much easier parallel to draw to a single night and a single, like, this is the culture of surrounding a fighter at any time.
And also there seems to be some universal truths in the movie. The universal truths, yeah. These archetypes are universal fighter. They're stereotypes of fighters, but they seem to be universal truths. You know, there's the fighter that hung on too long and he's drunk punch. I'm sure we still have that. We know we have that.
Yeah.
There's the fighter that's looking for his last big payday. He's hanging on. There's the fighter, you know, an up and coming star, the guy that's scared of what, you know, to be a fighter. The guy that's just not made out to be a fighter, who loses. He's not a boxer. He's not an MMA fighter. So that holds up. But it's like I said, for people who haven't seen it, I view it as a masterpiece. Don't take my word for it. Martin Scorsese views it as a masterpiece. Take my
word for it. I mean, I view it too. So, and I'm trustworthy, even if you're not.
I'm not trustworthy. Believe Zane. I know my word means jack shit around here. But if Zane Simon says it's worth watching, it's worth watching. At one point, all boxing movies basically had a moral lesson, that a down ending is a moral lesson, that there's something wrong with boxing. And after Rocky, even though he lost to Rocky, almost every boxing movie and every goddamn MMA movie has a feel-good ending.
Yeah.
And I think we got to examine that. There's something wrong with that.
It's bullshit because you spend enough time around this sport and you know that 99% of the endings in it are not happy.
Yeah, I think most fighters of any combat sport put in more than they get back.
Yeah. Even the ones who walk away being happy with and proud of what they did, the overwhelming narrative is usually that you didn't figure out when to get out. Almost all.
That you left a piece of yourself in the ring.
Yeah.
For sure. In the gym, in the ring, that you're never going to be quite the same. But it's worth watching. We're going to have I don't know what we're going to be the next movie. I don't know if we'll do this again. Maybe people hate this. We won't do it again. But if we do it again, I don't know what the next one is.
No, we'll do it again. I mean, it takes 2 or 3 times for people to really get the flavor and figure out whether it tastes awful or tastes good. So, you know, we got to do this a couple more times at least before we figure out whether it's just a terrible idea.
Yeah, I already know ahead of time anything I do is a terrible idea. But still, yeah. I don't give a shit about the fans, in other words. I'm doing this for myself because this is a subject matter I like.
There you go. That's the true combat sports ethos right there. Fuck all y'all. I'm doing this for me, and that's why I'm not going to walk away when everybody else knows that I should have. So on that note, you can find me on Twitter at @TheZaneSimon. You can find John on Twitter at HeyNotTheFace. Find both of us over at BloodyElbow.com in our various capacities and roles and week to week, all that. And, of course, we'll be back for more Bloody Elbow content, both of us doing other stuff on video sometime in the near future. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you next time.